All right. Hey guys, welcome back. Okay, today's focus is going to be that about colonialism or imperialism. Okay, so this is kind of one of my favorite things that we talk about between Napoleon and World War One. All right, I think along with the Industrial Revolution, okay, more than anything else, it really sets the stage, all right, for what's going to happen and why World War One becomes as big of a global event as it is. Okay. So we've kind of talked about colonialism here and there throughout the year, okay? So we're just going to kind of touch on what that is, okay? So it's known as the Age of Imperialism, all right? It's a time when the European nations would colonize the lands in Africa, the Americas, and even Asia, all right? So those are the three parts of the world they're going to, they're Europe. There's nothing to really colonize down in Antarctica. Yes, you can include Australia by the British, but the main chunks are the other parts of the world. Okay, and they kind of move in those directions. All right, kind of start meddling with Africa a little, going around the coast, and it moves west out to the Americas. And it's from the Caribbean goes north into North America, south through the rest of Latin America, and then though they start to expand more and more in Africa and make their way around Asia up through India to eventually China. And that's what we'll talk about in the next video. China is kind of that big prize. Okay, so as though where you get the idea of colonies, okay, they are lands controlled by another country for the benefit of the mother country, all right? Um, so in the America, we were colonies for the British beforehand. You saw how much the American citizens hated that, okay? We were actually one of the better treated colonies. We'll talk about, especially in Africa, how poorly some of those areas are treated. Um, we've also talked about Latin America with Spain and Portugal, okay? Another big colonial area, okay? So we've really talked about colonialism, just not the whole idea of it, okay? Some more of the political aspects, okay? Now, the way they would set up these colonies, okay, there are really two main ways they place power over them, okay? One, you've got military force, okay, sending in your troops and just kind of dominating them that way, forcing them to submission. The other is through diplomatic measures. Okay, some of these areas were not uh, as modernized as the European nations, so it's a little easier to sway and convince them, or just flat out lie to them to exploit them. Okay, and the main thing we're trying to get cheap labor from the people there, but also the natural resources there. Okay, there'll be a couple of maps throughout your notes. I really encourage you to look at showing the resources of countries through other parts of the world. Things like gold, oil, certain food products. Okay, things that we all rely on that don't come from where we are. Okay, one thing that I'll ask the class whenever we had a class is let's take our cell phones. Okay, take your phone, and mine's over there charging, so I don't have it. But that phone, one, we know it was not made in America. Okay, they were made over there in China or somewhere else in Asia. But then if you break it down to the individual pieces, it's kind of like what we did with that Colombian exchange diet. The copper to make the wires, okay, had to come from a copper mine somewhere, okay. Probably could have been South America, who knows. The things to make the batteries, all right. And I'm gonna some of you know those that stuff in detail more than I do. But the lithium and all that thing, the chemicals that make those products all came from different areas. Okay, just the plastics, all right, that make up the hard case and all that. Each little piece of your cell phone did not just come from one area. Okay, it was made from taking natural resources from all across the globe to put that thing together. Okay, and that's the whole point of colonies was there's all these resources out there. There's so many new things that we can make if we can just go and take all right the resources from those areas, all right, and they were able to provide the stuff for cheaper because the labor they hardly paid the people, or in some cases they enslaved them, um, and that's how they're to it's cheaper to get the resources, cheaper to make it, therefore they could sell it and make a profit. And sadly that process still goes on today. If you look at the you heard about the sweatshops for tennis shoes and our blue jeans and all that in Southeast Asia. Okay, I mean, if your phones are there made in America, we couldn't afford them. We already can't afford them. $1,000 iPhones is crazy, but the price would shoot through the roof if the labor was actually paid fairly. Okay, and that kind of process was still going has been going on for a couple of centuries. Okay, and colonialism really starts that. Okay, now, on top of exploiting them, okay, you're also going to impose your country's laws and customs on the local people there. Even though they've, over time, developed their own customs, their own ways of doing things, you're going to force them. One of the main things was trying to convert them to Christianity. We talked about that with Columbus, the God, Golden Glory. But there are other social, political things we try to impose. Some of it is for the better, all right, but a lot of times you're taking away the rich culture and history of those areas. So it's not always worth the new benefits. All right. Well, you can really divide imperialism into kind of two different stages. All right. The old imperialism, okay, your note says 1760 is the start. You can really predate it back to Columbus. Okay. The whole goal of old imperialism was finding trade routes to Asia. Okay. How can we get there to trade? As you go around Africa, thanks to Da Gama and then Diaz, all right, and eventually up to India, you set up these trade posts. Okay, so you kind of take over little small sections along the coastline to set up your people, build a relationship with the natives. You're not really taking over anything. You're just kind of setting up your little forts and all that. So that's kind of the start of it, setting up trade posts. And then as Columbus discovers the New World, the Americas, we've already talked about discovers there, but he gets the credit. All right. Then you do start setting up colonies. Okay. And then that continues through the American Revolution. And then a few decades later, Latin American independence following the Napoleonic Wars. So that's kind of the end of old imperialism. Okay. The Americas and some trade posts around Africa. Then, though, with the Industrial Revolution, okay, technology improving, the need for more natural resources, the need for cheaper labor to work in your factories and to harvest those resources, and the ability to ship more goods further across the nation, you get new imperialism, okay, from say 1870 till 1914. A lot of this stuff we've talked about, Industrial Revolution, all this stuff, you see it ending in 1914. That's because a lot of these changes through the globe end with World War One, and then you get a whole brand new slate of changes. Okay, World War One really is a turning point, just like the Napoleonic Wars were. Okay, and coincidentally, it's about 100 years apart. I always said history is cyclical. I mean, look what we're going through right now with the COVID-19. 102 years ago, you had a Spanish flu during World War One. So thank God we're not in a global war like they were then. But history is cyclical. You get major events, all right, kind of along the same path as they had in the past. Okay, so this new imperialism, okay, we can thank or blame the Industrial Revolution for it. All right. So you're going to start taking the labor and resources from these places to be used for your factories. Okay, so you take a good from a colony. Okay, maybe it's gold in Africa. All right, and I don't know what you're going to make gold. There's a ton of things, but let's just say you're going to make jewelry. You take the gold from Africa. All right, for very cheap. The people harvest it for you for very cheap. Okay, then you take it to your factory back in Europe, and then the workers get paid a lot better in the factory than the gold miners in Africa did, and you're able to sell it for a huge profit, way more than it was originally worth when it was taken. Okay, so it makes profit for the homeland at the expense of stealing the resources from the original land. Okay, the idea of social Darwinism takes fold in new imperialism, kind of the Europeans' justification for exploiting the natives and treating them so poorly. Social Darwinism is just a fancy way to say racism. Okay, the belief that some races were better or more superior than others, and that's why it was right for them to do what they did. Obviously, that is 100% incorrect, but that was a widespread belief, all right, that people advocated for to, like I said, to justify their actions. Okay, and then this new imperialism, it turns from just taking resources to trying to develop the largest empire around the globe. Okay. Um, so trying to do is it became more of a competition for bragging rights and looking stronger than your other nations, your other rivals, than it was for the actual goods you were trying to get from there. Okay? There's a good chart included in your notes talking about arguments for colonization. Not that I necessarily agree with all of it, but these were the reasons why they were doing what they were doing. Okay, raw materials, investments from companies. All right, so people can make a profit building companies like the joint stock company. In the Americas, you get things like that, just actual investors trying to start businesses, taking resources, needing new markets. Then you had the military and political arguments. Okay, set up bases around the globe, which United States, we do that all the time. All right, flat out security kind of ties in with that. But then national pride. Um, there were religious, okay, spread of Christianity. One thing that really stands out on there, the idea of the white man's burden. All right, and I don't really agree with this, but it is an interesting and important thought process. It's important to understand so that you know kind of the why they did what they did. So the white man's burden was that the white man, these places in Europe, okay, these industrialized nations were superior. And because they were better and because of their industrialization, their advanced political governments, whatever, um, it was necessary for them. It was their duty to go and um, kind of enlighten these other parts of the world, to teach them their ways of doing things, to show them how democracy worked, how to build newer, nicer homes, have hospitals and schools. And some of it was good, okay? Sometimes some areas do have it better and need to spread that to other parts of the world. Like I said, that ties into social Darwinism. It's not the white man's burden. It's not a burden that you should do, but that turns into that. And then that's one of the reasons, like, we're helping these people. That's why we're taking over and controlling them. Okay, it could have been something good, and in some cases it was, but it ended up getting exploited and used for bad reasons. Okay, and then technological, medical improvements happen because of this. Okay, so this is kind of why we are colonizing. When I say we, I'm talking about the Western nations, because the United States gets involved in this. All right. Now, American colonialism really starts with the Spanish-American War at the end of the 1800s. Very late to the game. I had a couple of reasons why. Industrial Revolution hadn't really picked up as quickly with us as it had in Great Britain, but it does eventually make its way. But then you get the Civil War, and the whole slavery debate was kind of taking up most of our interest. We had started reaching out to other lands, Africa, not Africa, Alaska, buying that, I think that was in the 1870s. We buy Alaska, I'd have to double check. And then not long before the Spanish-American War, you get the annexation of Hawaii, that's an interesting story that if we had more time, I'd go into detail on. But the Spanish-American War is really kind of the United States' first attempts at building up its own colonial empire. Okay, short war. It started over liberation of Cuba from Spain. Okay, that's kind of the last Spanish colony in the Americas. They also had control of the Philippines and Asia, and that's the last remnants of the old Spanish Empire. Well, the United States gets involved, and you've got a president, William McKinley, who really didn't care as much about imperial pursuits. Um, but the congressmen, business leaders of the nation, just really the whole mood of America was, let's get involved in Cuba, let's liberate them, but then let's kind of take over that stuff and build up our own colonies so we're not weaker than everybody else. So while he didn't really care as much about it, he does help drive that. Okay, so we have a little 4 month long war that started over a lie. Yellow journalism is really interesting to learn about that in 11th grade. But one couple of the main things that happened from the Spanish-American War: easy win. Theodore Roosevelt, greatest president of all time, becomes a national hero. All right, cool stories with him and San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill, the Rough Riders and all that. So that's kind of when he becomes an American hero. But then the United States is going to gain some territory. So while we free Cuba, we don't take over it, but we do get involved in Cuba. But then we buy the Philippines from Spain, so we have a colony out in Asia. And then we get control of Puerto Rico and Guam, which are still U.S. territories today. So that all happens as a result of the Spanish-American War. Now the United States has colonies. So in Asia, all right, we'll talk about more in the next video, but the United States has a big stronghold there due to the Philippines, which we still have a military base in the Philippines despite after World War II them granting their independence. But other than that, most of our colonial focus is in Latin America. So we talked about the Roosevelt Corollary last week. The United States said, hey, we're going to get involved in your affairs, adding on to the Monroe Doctrine. You also get development of the Panama Canal. Okay, one of Theodore Roosevelt's big goals was to build a canal that connected the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, and it's an amazing engineering feat. Okay, you do not achieve that without the Industrial Revolution. It's real cool, the system of locks and dams, and how they raise the water, and then you go and you raise it again. Because the bottom of the lake was higher than sea level. But you get that, and it's cool because the United States actually supports a rebellion from the local Panamanians who wanted freedom from Colombia. And in return, they let us build a canal through their country. The United States would control that canal for decades, almost a century. But you finally get the Panama Canal, so now you can go from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from Europe to Asia, going through the Americas, or even just connecting the east coast of the U.S. to the west coast, okay, due to the Panama Canal. So just to ruin some social things for you. Just remember, if you ever talk about the Biggie Tupac East Coast West Coast rivalry, you don't get that without the Panama Canal. Otherwise, they would still be two far separated parts of the country. So there you go, ruin some cool culture for y'all by tying it to history. Then though, let's get back to Latin America. You've got dollar diplomacy becomes kind of the United States foreign policy effort over in Latin America, and it's sending dollars over bullets. Instead of sending soldiers over there to fight, let's send financial aid. Let's give these countries loans to pay off things. In return, they will be in debt to us, they'll owe us, and therefore we can kind of dictate how policy in Latin America goes. And that still goes on today. Big talk was us cutting off funding to Venezuela over the way the country's gone, and it's gone a horrible direction. But one of our big rivals right now is Russia. Well, that's going to open the door for Russia to make its way into Venezuela and try to influence the people over there. So you still have these, even though colonialism has kind of stopped, you still have these imperial efforts popping back up today in kind of the same way. So I just thought that was kind of a cool modern day connection. Okay, hopefully that turns out better than things did at this time. There's also in your notes a great political cartoon about American imperialism. It's Uncle Sam as a teacher, kind of belittling some of the students. Some of it will make more sense after we talk about Asia next week, but really do kind of look at this and try to think critically about what's going on. It's one of my favorites because of how accurately it depicts some problems going on in the world with segregation and the reservations for Native Americans, us annexing these new territories, foreign policy with China. It's really interesting. So just kind of take some time, think critically about it, and then kind of research that political cartoon and see what it says about it. We talk more about it in class if we were there, obviously. Whatever. So that's kind of the United States role in it, okay? But the big prize, okay, in this new imperialism becomes Africa. Eventually it's China, but we really don't get involved in India and China until we've handled Africa, okay? So why Africa, okay? So Africa is this huge continent, okay? And a lot of its lands had never been explored before, okay? Areas that we did not know anything about, especially the deeper you get into the continent, okay? So Africa was just this fascinating place that we wanted to get a hold of, okay? There's also ununified, less developed, smaller kingdoms, okay? So you had societies throughout it, you had these kingdoms scattered throughout, but they never banded together and created large empires together. They were not as developed, okay, because they found a way that worked for them, kind of like the Native Americans did, and they kind of stuck to that, okay? They had great natural resources there. Just the Industrial Revolution does not hit until the areas get colonized over. So they were vulnerable. They were kind of an easy target to take advantage of due to their political structures. And then just there's this diverse geography. Okay, so there's some cool pictures throughout your notes. I'll get that in a minute, but the geography, it's not just all desert. Okay, it's so much more unique than that. With a continent that big, it would have to be unique and diversified. Okay. You also know it's vulnerable because the Ottoman Empire, it finally starts to decline. They lose control of their North African territories and Egypt and all that, and so those areas become vulnerable. While we always had access to the coastline, that North Africa area was always kind of off limits until the Ottoman Empire loses control of it. Well, there's great resources all throughout the continent, but does anybody know what the great resource in the northern desert part of Africa is? Oil. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution. A lot of the stuff we make will rely on oil. Okay, especially as transportation increases. So this kind of starts the European and then American reliance on northern Africa for those oil reserves, and now it's spread out. Like I mentioned Venezuela already. That's where we actually used to get a majority of our oil from. You've also got the end of the slave trade in the early 1800s. So we were around Africa, but now we needed a new reason for there. Okay, we weren't there getting slaves, but we still wanted to be involved there, take advantage of the trade posts and all that we set up, use our connections. So we started colonizing the area to take advantage of it. And then the development of vaccines. So because of these vaccines, it allowed you to go further into the continent without fear of catching some kind of foreign disease. So that's one of the medical advancements. So it became safer to explore. Therefore, you're able to do more exploration. So let's talk about some of those different regions. Okay, so if it's not on the website already, I will add it. Okay, there's a great article from National Geographic that kind of explains, I think it's 7 different geographical areas through Africa. Okay, probably the one that we best know is up north with the Sahara Desert. Okay, sand, desert, hot, miserable, not a lot there to do. Okay, and there's a map showing you which modern day nations fall under the Sahara. Okay, so that's probably what most of us think of. Same for kind of the next one just below that, and including part of the Sahara. It's called the African Sahel, which is kind of similar. It's a little more grassy, all right, a little greener in different spots. Um, but the Sahel, and we'll get to the savannah later. That's kind of what most people think of. Okay, looks like the areas where like Lion King would have taken place. But then if you go east, okay, kind of that little point on the side, that brings you to the Ethiopian highlands. Okay, so a grand mountainous plateau region, great caverns, not caverns, but crevices throughout. So not something that people really picture. Okay, then we mentioned the savannah. Okay, grasslands, trees, still pretty dry and hot, but a lot more diverse than the Sahara was. The Swahili coast. Okay, so if you go down on the coastline, you get kind of what you would think of if you went to the Bahamas or something with the African Swahili coast. A little more tropical, so to speak. Okay, and then one of my favorites to learn about. Okay, the African rainforest. We'll talk about this with the Congo. If you've ever watched the Jungle Book, if you're familiar with that story, we can thank Rudyard Kipling for it. But the rainforest. Okay, so they have rainforests in Central Africa, just like you've got in South America, with tall trees, very wet. Very humid, diverse geography. Okay, but the Jungle Book took place in what would have been the African rainforest. Um, so, like I said, one of my favorite areas that I think is kind of most interesting about Africa. You've even got the Great Lakes, kind of like what we have in around Ohio and Michigan, the United States. Africa's got some Great Lake areas. Okay, so very, very moist, very wet. Um, Any fans of Black Panther? Okay, the nation of Wakanda would have been around where these Great Lakes were. So just a little fun fact, but Wakanda's obviously not real. So you've got Great Lakes. Okay, you don't really think of there being a lot of water in Africa, but yet you've got that. Okay, um, and then there's something in the southern part that we left off. But those are the kind of different, diverse regions. So let's talk about this trying to conquer Africa. Okay, so the attempt to colonize it is known as the scramble for Africa. There's this mad rush by the European nations. Who can get there first and who can get control of the most areas? Okay, so Egypt is one of the most important areas that gets colonized. Okay, the British get there, and one of the most important things that they're able to get from that is the Suez Canal. So Egypt's there. You got the Nile River, but Egypt was kind of in between. All right, between the Red Sea, which leads out to the Indian Ocean, and above that, the Mediterranean Sea, which connected it to Europe. So the British are going to build a canal, kind of like America did with Panama, that connects the Mediterranean to Asia. Okay, so now you don't have to go around the continent. You can cut that trip down about 67%, and you can just go straight through the Suez Canal. All right, so the British, that gives them a stronghold and a shortcut to Africa, so it gives them or to Asia, so it gives them an advantage from colonizing the Asian lands, especially India. All right, because that Suez Canal is incredibly important. British will hold on to this until the 16th or the 1950s when you get the Suez War as part of the conflict between the Cold War and the Soviet Union sponsoring rebels there to try to get their independence. But brings great wealth to the British. All right, they also they don't colonize Egypt. Egypt will remain independent, but the British call themselves a protectorate of Egypt. It's the same thing the United States does of Cuba. It says we're not going to colonize you, but we're going to get involved in your affairs and we're going to protect you when issues arise. So kind of that unofficial colonial leader. Then the Congo, okay? So this is where that African rainforest was. Belgium gets there, okay, due to advances in vaccines, but this is known as what is the heart of Africa, okay, that deep, dark jungle. There's a book called The Heart of Darkness, famous novel. I'm sure you'll read about if you go to college in, I think, British literature. I have to double check, but it's a famous novel, okay, about going deeper into Africa, okay? So this is kind of that first expedition into the rainforest. Then in the late 1840s, okay, this is after all that unification of Germany and Italy that we talked about, you get something called the Berlin Conference. So everybody's trying to fight to get control of different parts of Africa. So they finally agree, hey, let's just sit down, talk about this, and decide who's going to get what. So they divide up the continent between the different European countries. Problem is that not a single African leader is involved in these talks. Even though they were smaller and less unified, okay, they still had kings or kingdoms. They had leaders. They had people in charge that should have had to say, hey, who's going to be involved in my country? Well, who do I want to work with? Instead, they flat ignored them, and the European leaders decided for themselves. That'd be like me with you and your siblings and your parents, and I'm saying, all right, this is who's going to do what chore around your house, and this is who's going to cook what meals and then bring them to myself. Okay, so this I'm going to tell you, your mom, your dad, brother, sister, whatever, cousins, this is who's doing what. I should have no say in being able to do that. Don't worry, I'm not going to try to tell you who's to do what, but if you want to cook me food, fine, go for it. Just kidding. But I'd have no right to be over there. But yet the European leaders, same situation, and instead they involve themselves in that without including or referring to any of the African leaders. So the way the continent gets divided up, okay, France gets the largest chunks of land, okay, they get a lot of that Sahara Desert, it's called French West Africa, but they get, as far as square mileage goes, they get the most of Africa. But a lot of that land is kind of just worthless desert, all right, there's really not a lot of value that comes from it. The British get the more valuable sections of land, okay, things like um, down in South Africa, which is why South Africa is predominantly white. You've got, like we mentioned, with Egypt and kind of that little northeastern chunk. There's a couple of areas set up along the coastline. So the British get kind of the more valuable sections. There's a map, and you notice that shows you. Germany was late to it, okay, because Germany, like 4 years before this Berlin Conference happened, all right, was still Prussia and the Southern German Confederation. So they had finally unified. So they didn't really have a lot of colonial territory. So they're kind of picking at scraps as what's left over. Italy, on the other hand, really gets embarrassed. So they tried to go and colonize what is Ethiopia, and the Italian soldiers get defeated by the Ethiopians and then kicked out of there. In fact, in World War II, Mussolini is going to, before World War II breaks out, reinvade Ethiopia, which is a violation of the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. One of the things that helps leads to World War II, but he's kind of getting payback to inspire the Italian people to make up for that. But Italy actually, like I said, gets defeated, which is embarrassing because they were viewed as being superior to the other African nations. So that's how the continent is divided up. Like I said, there's a map that shows like Spain and Portugal get a little bit here and there. I think the Netherlands outside of Belgium, well, Belgium, they get the Congo. I think the rest of the Netherlands tries to get some territory. I'm trying to pull up the map right now. Let's see who all else I left out. But that's how the continent gets divided up. Let's see. Russia doesn't really get anything there. Yeah, Portugal, Spain. So that's really it. Okay, that's really it for Europe getting involved. The United States doesn't get too involved in this colonization of Africa because we were more focused on Latin America because that was who was right next door to us. And then as far as Asia was concerned, we had the Philippines. Now, we talked about this, but we mentioned there's a lot of bad that comes from it. Okay, so some of the consequences that happen as a result of it. Okay, the colonies that had better or more resources, they benefit from this colonization. Okay, because they're going to treat them well. Okay, so the European nations, they're like, look, we're going to be here a lot. We need these people on our side. We're going to have our people there more often. So let's make this place a little nicer. All right. So they start investing in building schools there, hospitals to treat people, infrastructure, things that are necessary for a community to advance. Okay. Infrastructure allows you to travel. It makes it easier for more people to come through. If more people are coming through, they're going to spend money there, which is tourism dollars, even though you're not really tourists there. All right. You're still spending money as you go through there. If you're going to start up a new factory, you want it to be easier to ship goods back and forth. Schools to educate the people there, so you got more educated people around, healthier people for the locals, but also for the Europeans that are coming over. But the areas that didn't have those great resources, and that was a lot of the continent, they're suffering. They're taking advantage of it. Okay, back when the slave trade was going on, a lot of their people were taken away, so their society was already lacking because they had lost them the best, the strongest of their community. Okay, so they're already hurting there, and that's one reason why they were not able to advance as far as the Europeans were, because they were missing people. But then they're going to export their natural resources to Europe. Okay, so you're taking away this gold, this silver, this ivory, these um, copper, whatever it is that's naturally there, or the oil, and then you're going to take it at very little profit to the colony, if anything, no profit to the Europeans, to be turned into something to bring wealth and jobs to Europe. Um, so while there's great wealth in Africa, they had never really been able to take advantage of that. And when colonization does eventually end, all right, people are so desperate that it leads to a lot of corruption to try to get a hold of that. People try to recreate that. And then just really true poor treatment of the locals. Um, huge mistreatment, though, and it's going to be the same in Asia, but just they're not treated like regular people. Okay, it's almost like slavery all over again. All right, so there's kind of showing the difference between the treatment of the two different groups. So there's a table on there showing the wages for the Italians who would go down to Africa to work, and then the indigenous people. Okay, and you see that with all the jobs, there was a huge price difference, all right, as to who was getting paid for the same amount of work, or even more work for the indigenous and less for the Italians. Okay, there's this big gap there because they didn't view them as equal. All right, like we said, you still see some of that going on today with sweatshops around the world, especially in Southeast Asia. So that has not truly gone away. A lot of it has, a lot of it's improved, but not to the level where it should. Okay, so that's kind of what happens to Africa. It's real sad, and they're still dealing with a lot of the effects of it today. Now let's switch. All right, move a little bit northeast, right, up to India. Okay, so very early on in this colonization, as soon as we're able to get around to India, the British create a company, okay, to handle affairs over there. It's called the British East India Company because they're very clever with naming things. So they're going to kind of, instead of the government ruling India, all right, it's going to be this company. They ruled on behalf of the British. Okay, at first Portugal was the most dominant force there because of the Treaty of Tordesillas. They eventually get Portugal just can't keep up. They lose control of it. Great Britain replaces them, especially, or at least the company does. One thing that they're really well known for is how poorly they treated the native Indians there. Um, but at one point, this company ran half of all the world trade. I don't mean half of it for the British. I mean all the trade in the world, half of it went through this company. The Boston Tea Party is a result of this monopoly. Okay, so they wanted to buy tea from Holland because it's cheaper. British said nope, buy it from ours. British East India Company is going to be the one selling it to you. It's going to cost more. So at one point they controlled half that all there. And in fact, this company had its own army. All right, and this army was larger than the actual British army. Think about if Walmart had its own army. Okay, and Walmart the company had an army larger than that of the United States military. You don't see that today at all, but at that time there was a need for them to have an army because they're trying to control foreign land, and so if the company ever broke against the nation, they could have probably defeated the British government. But the British East India Company comes to an end in the mid 1850s after what is known as the Great Rebellion. Okay, so we'll get to that, but first let's kind of talk about what colonial India was like. So we mentioned the Mughal Empire as part of the Gunpowder Empires. Thanks to Genghis Khan, you get construction of the Taj Mahal. That was India's last golden age, okay, the last time that they were truly a strong, powerful place. Then the British East India Company comes along and takes over all of that for themselves, okay. So the Great Rebellion, so the story here is you got Indians who fought for the British India Company's army were known as sepoys, okay. And there's two religious groups in India. You've got Hindus and you've got Muslims. All right, those are the two main religious groups. Well, one, all right, believed that it was immoral, unholy to have your lips to consume pork in any way. The other was beef. Well, the British East India Company uses these soldiers, these local Indians, to fight for the army, and they made this new change to the way the guns worked. Okay, so they use these grease packages to control the powder. So they said, look, we're giving each person these new packet cartridges. So anytime that you're going to fight, you need to load your gun using this. And the way it would work is you just bite the paper off the packet, pour it in there. That gave you the perfect amount you need for a shot instead of having to eyeball and spill. Well, to seal the paper when they were filling it up the first time, it was rumored that they were using oil and fat from, and I can't remember which one it was either pig or cow. Well, to the sepoys who were either Buddhist or Muslim, or not Buddhist, Hindu or Muslim, that's a violation of their religion. They, in their minds, they would have gone to hell for consuming, all right, that because as soon as they bite that package, that oil is touching their lips, all right. They don't have to swallow anything, but they've now technically consumed it. They would go to hell for that in their religion. They believe that. But yet the army is telling them they have to do that. They have to follow this new policy. So they refused to abide by it. They said, no, I can't do this. And then the British East India Company, the soldiers start attacking the sepoys, throw them in jail, and publicly embarrass them in front of anyone to try to discourage this. Well, finally, the Indian people get fed up with that, and they start rebelling. Now, it kind of shows different perspectives. This is taught one of two ways. Some call it the Sepoy Mutiny. Those who think that they were barbaric, going crazy because of something as simple as a grease cartridge. The Indians refer to it as the Great Rebellion, as their final fight against tyranny from the British from taking over them. But because of the Great Rebellion, all right, the British East India Company will dissolve. India will still be under British colonial rule, but it'll now be the government instead of that company. Okay, but this is even today they still celebrate the Great Rebellion over there. But the British, like I said, even with that, they're not going to give up India. Okay, India was their most prized possession. They actually refer to it as the crown jewel of the British Empire. Okay, they could care less about what they had in America when that started or what they formed in Africa. To them, the most important of all their colonial possessions was India. That's why they create the Suez Canal, so they can get a shortcut there. All right, and so in India, so they in this colony, they make a lot of reforms. Okay, these reforms though didn't help the majority of the Indians; it helped the elites of Indian society. Okay, so they say, look, we're doing these that the Indian people wanted, but it's only the elites of the society that wanted those. A lot of what happens is the British are going to neglect what the majority need. Okay, and they start hoarding their food resources and crops to feed themselves. And there's actually going to be this mass starvation that takes place throughout the country. Okay, there's an article I'll try to post on the website that talks about why and how that happens. But the British bringing rice and other grain and things that were grown in India, okay, they started focusing on growing that cash crop so they could bring it back to the British so they could have access to that, something that didn't grow well over there. Well, they forced the farmers to stop growing other crops that the people needed, and even this rice that they're making, there's not enough for the people to go around because it's all being sent up to Britain. So at least the starvation, all right, throughout the continent, okay, or not the continent, throughout the nation. And India still truly hasn't recovered from the starvation or the poverty that's formed from that. Also in colonial India, you've got Mahatma Gandhi. This is where he comes into play. So Gandhi actually went to South Africa, to the British colony there, to train to be a lawyer in one of the British colonial schools. And there he saw the mistreatment of the local South Africans by the British and realized same thing's happened to us in India. So he gives up law and he goes back to India and forms the nonviolent resistance to British rule. And eventually, after World War II, they're able to achieve that. Okay. So that's kind of it for imperialism. Now, I encourage you, there's one last chart to look at. It's talking about population growth. Okay. So this is saying if in the year 1650, if 100 people lived in Africa, then there would have been 103. So they had 103% of the 100% that Africa had. Asia dwarfed everybody. For every 100 person in Africa, there were 257 in Asia. Well, then it shows how every 100 years and then 50 years from 1850 to 1900, how that rate changed. And you see from 1850 to 1900, 20 more people or 20% more. But yet the rest of the world has quadrupled around them, okay? Because of the colonial exploitation of these lands, they're not able to advance and prosper and grow like the rest of the world, so they stay behind. And that is why these parts of the world are still known for being very poor today, okay? Because they never had that chance to get ahead. They had their resources that they could have used to profit from taken away from them without any fair compensation in return. So imperialism is a fascinating topic. Okay, there's a great history there from the American perspective. The British are the kings of imperialism. I mean, look at that last map showing countries that had been under European control. There's only like 3 nations throughout the world who had never been colonized by Europe. The majority of those colonies were by the British. Okay, so it's fascinating, but is a lot of evil that kind of comes from that. A lot of mistreatment of locals, things that need to be acknowledged. Um, that shows that some of it's not right. But yet, even today, we still see some of the traits of imperialism around the globe today. So that's all I got for y'all as far as imperialism goes. I'll get one up very soon about Asia, and then hopefully next week. I want to say by Tuesday, but let's be honest, say by Wednesday, I'll get your first video up for your packet. Okay, starting with World War One. Okay, I'm gonna start doing a little shorter videos, kind of taking chunks, different aspects at a time. If you have any questions, please, like I said, comment, email, or ask me through their mind. But thank y'all, and y'all continue to take care and stay safe.